didn't brace for this, it snapped. Because overnight, old interviews, resurfaced clips, and long-buried family tension collided into one explosive narrative that has fans saying the quiet part out loud. Was Tamar Braxton right all along? Towanda Braxton's name shot up the trending list after her ex-husband's words began circulating again, and suddenly, the storyline nobody wanted to revisit was dragged back into the spotlight with fresh intensity. This wasn't a clean accusation. It wasn't a neat confession. It was messier, layered with resentment, hindsight, and moments that now look very different through a 2026 lens. What shook people wasn't just what was said, it was when it resurfaced. Comments that once felt emotional now sound intentional. Silence that once looked dignified now reads strategic. Fans started replaying family arguments, especially Tamar's infamous confrontations, asking whether those outbursts were less about chaos and more about warning signs nobody wanted to hear. Twitter threads exploded. TikTok stitched reactions together like evidence. And suddenly, Tamar's long-dismissed side comments were being reevaluated as uncomfortable foresight. The ex-husband's perspective lit the fuse. Not because it proved anything, but because it reopened questions the family worked hard to bury. Loyalty, accountability, who gets protected, who gets painted as too much, and who ends up looking right once the dust settles. The backlash was immediate, the defenses were fierce, and the Braxton family narrative cracked just enough to let doubt rush in. And now fans are split down the middle, asking one dangerous question. Was this exposure, or was it confirmation that the truth was always louder than the silence? The moment the old clips began circulating again, the conversation didn't ease in, it detonated. Towanda Braxton's name surged across timelines, not because of something new she said, but because of something old that suddenly felt different. An interview her ex-husband gave years ago. A few comments that once sounded like bitterness. A tone that people dismissed at the time as emotional fallout. Now, recontextualized, those same words were being treated like delayed revelations. And the internet did what it always does when context shifts. It rewrote the story in real time. To be clear, nothing here arrived as a clean confession or a verified exposé. What resurfaced were claims, perspectives, and interpretations, not court documents, not sworn statements, not definitive proof. But online, perception moves faster than verification. A clip of Towanda's ex-husband discussing their marriage began circulating with captions suggesting he had been telling the truth all along. Fans didn't just watch, they replayed, pausing on phrases, highlighting tone, treating hindsight like evidence. What made this combustible was how quickly Tamar Braxton's past comments were pulled into the frame. Old family arguments, reunion blow-ups, moments where Tamar accused her sisters of being dishonest, manipulative, or unwilling to take accountability. At the time, those scenes were framed as Tamar being explosive, dramatic, or difficult. Now, some viewers began asking an uncomfortable question. What if those outbursts were warnings, not chaos? That question split the audience instantly. One side argued this was unfair revisionism, taking a divorced man's perspective and turning it into confirmation bias against Towanda. The other side insisted patterns were emerging that couldn't be ignored anymore. They pointed to moments on the show where Towanda appeared evasive, to interviews where details shifted over time, to Tamar's repeated insistence that certain truths were being buried for the sake of family image. None of it was conclusive. All of it was combustible. The ex-husband's words were treated like a spark, not because they proved anything, but because they reopened wounds. He spoke about feeling unsupported, about dynamics that felt one-sided, about behaviors that, in hindsight, he claimed weren't accidental. These were his experiences, framed as such, but the internet flattened that nuance fast. What began as "this is how he felt" turned into "this is what happened" in comment sections across platforms. Social media accelerated the shift. TikTok creators stitched Tamar's past arguments next to the ex-husband's interview clips, drawing parallels that felt persuasive even without evidence. Twitter threads laid out timelines, selectively quoting moments to support a narrative that Tamar had been calling things out for years while being dismissed as the problem. The phrase "Tamar was right" trended not as a conclusion, but as a rallying cry. Towanda notably didn't respond. No statement, no clarification, no attempt to contextualize the resurfaced interview. That silence was read in opposite ways depending on the viewer's bias. Supporters saw dignity and refusal to engage in internet pylons. Critics saw avoidance. And in the absence of clarification, interpretation took over. Silence doesn't stop narratives online, it feeds them. The family dynamic made everything heavier. The Braxtons aren't just celebrities, they're a brand built on transparency, conflict, and reconciliation. Fans feel invested, almost entitled, to decode their relationships. That sense of ownership turns speculation into participation. People weren't just discussing Towanda, they were auditing the family's history, rewatching scenes, and assigning motives retroactively. What complicated matters further was how gender and tone influenced perception. Towanda has often been framed as the quieter sister, the peacemaker. Tamar, by contrast, has been labeled loud, aggressive, or unstable. This resurfacing flipped that dynamic for some viewers. They began questioning whether Tamar's delivery overshadowed the substance of what she was saying, whether the family's preference for calm over confrontation allowed certain issues to remain unresolved and unaddressed publicly. Critics of the Tamar was right narrative pushed back hard. They argued that divorce stories are always subjective, that ex-spouses have incentives to frame narratives favorably for themselves. They warned against turning one person's grievances into a definitive character judgment of Towanda. They emphasized that reality TV editing distorts behavior and that family arguments don't equal factual exposure. These points were valid, but they struggled to compete with the emotional satisfaction of a long-ignored voice seemingly being validated. As the first wave of reaction settled, blogs and commentary channels amplified the tension. Headlines used words like exposed and confirmed, even when the content itself acknowledged uncertainty. Viewers skimmed, shared, and reacted without reading disclaimers. That's how narratives harden. The word allegedly fades, replaced by assumption. Throughout this phase, one thing became clear. This wasn't about proving guilt or innocence. It was about reframing history. Once viewers decide a past conflict makes sense now, they resist letting go of that clarity, even if it's built on fragments, even if it's unfair. As Section 1 closes, the situation remains unresolved but undeniably altered. No facts have been established. No official responses issued. Yet the perception of Towanda Braxton has shifted in certain corners of the internet, not because of new evidence, but because old material has been assigned new meaning. And once meaning changes, the conversation rarely goes back to neutral. The real question now isn't whether the exposure is real. It's whether the internet is prepared to sit with uncertainty, or if it prefers a story that feels finished, even when it isn't. As the second wave hit, the conversation stopped being about the ex-husband's words alone and turned into a full re-audit of Towanda Braxton's public image. The internet didn't just replay the interview. It layered it with years of footage, arguments, and unresolved family tension, creating a composite narrative that felt convincing even without confirmation. This is where things got dangerous, because once a story feels coherent, people stop asking whether it's fair. What fueled this phase was pattern building. Viewers began compiling moments from the show where Towanda appeared hesitant, guarded, or conflicted, framing those traits as intentional rather than situational. Scenes that once read as emotional exhaustion were now labeled avoidance. Moments of silence were reinterpreted as strategy. None of this was proven, but in internet logic, consistency of interpretation can outweigh facts. Tamar's role in this phase became even more central. Fans resurfaced clips where she accused her sisters of hiding behind politeness or protecting an image instead of the truth. At the time, those outbursts were widely criticized as disruptive and disrespectful. Now, supporters argued they sounded prophetic. They claimed Tamar wasn't attacking Towanda personally. She was attacking a family system that rewarded quiet compliance over honesty. That reframing cast Tamar not as the antagonist, but as the inconvenient truth-teller. This interpretation ignited fierce backlash. Critics accused fans of romanticizing Tamar's confrontational style and using it to justify tearing down Towanda based on incomplete information. They pointed out that being loud doesn't equal being right, and being quiet doesn't equal being guilty. They warned that the internet was turning emotional conflict into moral judgment, a dangerous leap with real consequences. The ex-husband's perspective continued to be amplified, often stripped of nuance. His statements about feeling unsupported or misrepresented were presented as objective truths rather than subjective experiences. That flattening is common in viral discourse. Personal pain becomes evidence once it aligns with a narrative people want to believe. The fact that relationships are complex and multi-sided was largely ignored. What made this phase especially volatile was how quickly empathy shifted. Early on, many viewers expressed sympathy for Towanda, emphasizing how difficult divorce can be and how unfair it is to relitigate old relationships online. But as the Tamar was right narrative gained momentum that empathy eroded, skepticism replaced it. Support turned conditional. Silence began to feel suspicious rather than protective. Social media algorithms played their role. Content that framed Towanda as exposed performed better than content urging caution. Outrage and certainty drive engagement. Ambiguity doesn't. As a result, measured voices were drowned out by hot takes. The story didn't escalate because of new information. It escalated because certainty is addictive. Towanda's continued silence became a lightning rod. Supporters argued she owed the internet nothing, that responding would only legitimize speculation. Critics countered that silence allowed damaging interpretations to spread unchecked. This is the impossible bind public figures face: speak and risk escalation, or stay quiet and risk narrative takeover. There is no neutral choice once the internet decides a story matters. Family dynamics complicated everything further. Fans speculated about why other Braxton sisters weren't speaking up. Was the silence collective strategy, quiet support, or internal disagreement? Every absence was read as intentional. The lack of a unified response was treated as confirmation that something was wrong, even though families often avoid public conflict precisely to prevent escalation. Commentators began using language like mask slipping and truth finally catching up, phrases that imply inevitability without evidence. These phrases are powerful because they suggest a story has been unfolding all along, just waiting to be noticed. Once that framing takes hold, opposing facts feel like denial rather than balance. As Section 2 unfolds, the situation reaches a critical point, not because anything has been proven, but because perception has shifted. Towanda Braxton is no longer being discussed as a neutral figure caught in a messy past. She's being discussed as a character in a story the internet feels confident it understands. That confidence, built on fragments and reinterpretation, is what makes this phase so damaging. The question now isn't whether Tamar was right or wrong. It's whether the internet is willing to acknowledge how easily it turns complexity into conviction and how hard it is to reverse once it does. By the time the third phase took shape, the noise wasn't getting louder, it was getting heavier. The internet had moved past reaction and into conclusion mode, and that's always the most dangerous stage of a viral narrative. Not because new facts emerged, but because people felt finished with the story. And once an audience feels finished, nuance becomes an inconvenience. At this point, Towanda Braxton wasn't being discussed as a person navigating a complicated divorce and a complicated family anymore. She was being discussed as a symbol, a stand-in for larger ideas about accountability, silence, and who gets believed when stories resurface years later. That symbolic shift mattered because symbols don't get the benefit of context. They get simplified, judged, and stored away. The Tamar was right refrain solidified in this phase, not as a question, but as an assertion. Fans spoke about it as if a verdict had been reached. They revisited old episodes with a sense of discovery, pointing out moments where Tamar looked frustrated, dismissed, or isolated. Scenes that once felt chaotic were reframed as emotional exhaustion from not being heard. This reinterpretation didn't rely on new information. It relied on emotional coherence. The story made sense now, so it felt true. Critics continued to push back, but their arguments changed tone. Instead of debating details, they warned about consequences. They pointed out how quickly public perception can harden around someone without due process. They reminded viewers that divorce narratives are inherently one-sided when told by one party, and that reality TV editing distorts behavior for entertainment. These cautions landed with some, but not enough to reverse momentum. Towanda's silence by this stage was no longer just silence. It had been assigned meaning. To supporters, it represented dignity and refusal to feed a harmful cycle. To critics, it symbolized avoidance and lack of accountability. The truth may have been far more mundane: exhaustion, legal advice, or simple refusal to engage. But the internet rarely accepts mundane explanations when drama is available. What made this phase especially unsettling was how empathy narrowed. Early conversations acknowledged complexity. Later conversations demanded clarity and sides. People stopped asking, "What really happened?" and started asking, "Why won't she admit it?" That shift reveals how quickly curiosity turns into entitlement. Once an audience believes it deserves answers, silence feels like an offense. Family silence amplified that sense of entitlement. Other Braxton sisters remained publicly quiet, and that absence was interpreted in every possible way. Some fans believed it showed support for Towanda behind the scenes. Others believed it proved Tamar had been right all along and that the family had chosen image over truth. Again, no evidence confirmed either interpretation, but interpretation was enough to keep the narrative alive. Media coverage in this phase grew more cautious on the surface, but more definitive in tone. Headlines hedged with allegedly, while thumbnails and commentary implied resolution. Viewers skimmed and absorbed conclusions without reading disclaimers. This is how narratives become sticky. The caution exists, but it's overshadowed by implication. A quieter conversation also began among longtime fans who felt uneasy with how fast judgment arrived. They asked whether the internet was punishing Towanda for being reserved in a family that values performance, whether Tamar's vindication narrative ignored her own complexity and growth, whether the need to declare a right sister and a wrong sister flattened a family dynamic that has always been more fractured than fans want to admit. That discomfort didn't trend, but it lingered. Because at the heart of this saga is a question that has no viral answer. Can past conflicts be reinterpreted fairly without turning people into villains? Or does hindsight always demand someone be blamed? As the conversation slowed, something important became clear. This wasn't an exposure in the traditional sense. No new documents, no definitive proof, no official statements. What happened instead was a reframing of history, of personalities, of family roles. And reframing can be just as powerful as revelation, even when it's built on interpretation rather than fact. Towanda Braxton may never respond publicly. Tamar may never directly address this specific resurgence. The family may choose silence as a form of containment rather than confession. And that lack of closure will frustrate people who want a clean ending. But clean endings are rare in real families, especially ones that live their pain in public. As Section 3 closes, the story sits in an uneasy place. Perception has shifted, but certainty remains out of reach. Tamar's past words feel validated to some, overextended to others. Towanda's silence feels dignified to some, suspicious to others. No single version satisfies everyone, and that may be the most honest outcome of all. Because sometimes, what gets exposed isn't a secret, it's how badly people want one. If you stayed through all of this, it's because you felt how uncomfortable this story really is. Not explosive in a clean, satisfying way, but heavy, unresolved, and deeply human. This wasn't about a single interview or a viral clip. It was about how fast the internet rewrites history once it decides someone was right all along, and what that costs the people on the other side of that story. This is where you lean in, not scroll away. Hit like if you noticed how quickly hindsight turned into judgment. Drop a comment because the comment section is where the real conversation belongs, not who do you believe, but how do families survive when old wounds get reopened for public consumption. And subscribe right now because stories like this don't end with a headline. They resurface quietly, when someone finally speaks, when silence breaks, or when patterns repeat in ways people can't ignore. If you miss the next update, you miss the context, and without context, the loudest narrative always wins. This channel exists to slow these moments down, to separate exposure from interpretation, and to ask the questions most people rush past. Because sometimes what's being exposed isn't a person, it's the audience's need for certainty in situations that were never simple to begin with. Stay here, stay thoughtful. Because the most lasting damage doesn't come from secrets being revealed, it comes from conclusions being rushed.